Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. In this video, I'm going to be ranking my top 5 favorite movies. Let's get into it. Alright, so I would say each one of these movies is a 10 out of 10. That's not a score I take lightly either, and generally it takes a lot more than just the technical aspects of a film or any of its other objective qualities to get a perfect score out of me. I don't really care how technically good a movie is. It will almost never get a perfect score out of me unless the film means something to me personally. Every film I'm about to list is important to me because of either emotional attachment of some sort or nostalgia. I'm saying this because I don't want you to think that I'm necessarily saying each one of these films is just a perfect movie. Although with a couple of them I would argue that they are, but that's not what this video is about. Basically, this is just if I was stranded on a desert island and I could only take 5 movies with me, these are the 5 I would take. And this list wasn't easy to come up with because I had about 20 movies that I wanted to put on here that kept popping in my head, so it was pretty hard just narrowing it down to 5. And honestly, all of these movies are perfect films to me personally. So even just ranking these 5 was pretty hard because, I mean, perfect is perfect. You can't get better than perfect. So what kind of a measuring stick am I going to use to rank these? And basically I decided that rewatchability was the only method that was fair and made sense. But seeing as how it is a ranking of my top 5 favorite movies of all time, I'm not looking at my 5th spot as the worst of 5. I'm just looking at it as the 5th best. But before I start, I do have 2 honorable mentions. My first honorable mention is 1993's Tombstone. You have a serious ensemble cast here with Kurt Russell, Val Kilmer, Bill Paxton, Sam Elliott, and Michael Biehn, and more. This has some of the most quotable and epic dialogue ever put to screen. I was never a huge Western fan, and I'm honestly still not, but this movie transcended its genre. And I know they took a lot of liberties with the story to make it as Hollywood as possible, but honestly, I don't care. This is one of the most powerful and performance-driven films ever made. I wanted to put it in the top 5, but I just couldn't justify it over the 5 that I ultimately came up with, but still an amazing movie, and I literally have nothing bad to say about this film. It just didn't quite make the top 5. My second honorable mention is Wes Craven and Kevin Williamson's 1996 classic, Scream. What a game changer. This movie gave the slasher genre the second wind it needed and revitalized an otherwise dead genre, and gave us a whole new wave of slasher movies in the late 90s and early 2000s. And even though this isn't the first time slashers were financially successful, I would still argue that Scream made slashers more mainstream and brought them into the zeitgeist in a way that they had never been before. One could even argue that that happened with the early 80s boom of slashers, but Scream is definitely a contender for that title, and what this movie had that most of those other movies didn't was an amazing cast and a focus on the other characters, not just the villain. In fact, there's even more of a focus on the survivors, especially when you get into the sequels. And other than Laurie Strode with Halloween, that's really one of the first times that had ever been successfully done in slasher movies. I mean, what Wes Craven and Kevin Williamson brought to life here was nothing short of amazing. And wow, just such a good movie. But now we're at the top 5, and in 5th place we have American Pie. This is definitely my favorite comedy, but as you can see, obviously one of my favorite movies in general. I don't think any of the actors went into this movie actually thinking it was going to have the impact that it had or be nearly as big as it was. That's made pretty clear when you watch all of the behind the scenes and the interviews with all of the cast members. They just had literally no idea. They thought they were just making this small little isolated movie, and it ended up being this gigantic thing that literally defined comedy for an entire generation. This movie was truly amazing, and very similar to what happened with Scream, this movie inspired an entire wave of secondhand knockoffs that were not nearly as good as this film. The only movies that this movie inspired that were even remotely close to being as good as this were its own sequels. And that's actually another thing this movie has in common with Scream. Unlike a lot of franchises, this movie produced 3 theatrical sequels, and every single one of them was a solid film. Yeah, they're not as good as the first one, but they were all good movies. And it's very rare that any franchise with that many sequels is that consistent. So when it does happen, it's kind of a treasure to the fans of that franchise. And the way I was introduced to these movies is actually kind of funny. My mom actually took me to see American Pie 2 in theaters by accident. I don't know who all remembers this, but when they were marketing the second movie, it was very misleading because they were showing trailers of this movie on kids' movies, and none of my family, including me, had seen the first American Pie. So we had no idea what to expect. But let's just say that was a very weird movie to watch with your mom. Yeah, but I still loved it, and I insisted on watching the first one. So I made it a point to go out and rent the first one, and I watched it, and I fell in love with it. And I've been a diehard fan of these movies ever since. Not the straight-to-video spin-off movies. All of those are garbage, and I hate that those movies left such a stain on this franchise's reputation, because I've talked to a lot of people who are like, no, there's more than 4 American Pies. There's like 10 or 12, and it's like, no, I don't even count those. And that right there tells me you are not a real fan, because any actual fan of these movies don't even count those. There are 4 American Pie movies as of right now. That's it. But I digress. So the chemistry all these actors have with each other was just unreal. It doesn't even feel like you're watching a scripted movie. It feels like you're just watching footage of a bunch of real friends and teenagers interacting with each other. It was that perfect. That's the kind of thing you could never go back and recreate on purpose. This movie was truly an example of lightning in a bottle. In 4th place is John Carpenter's 1978 classic, Halloween. What could I possibly say about this movie that hasn't already been said to death on here and everywhere else, honestly? This movie was just a perfect slasher movie, and pretty much a perfect movie if you ask me. This film was the template for success. Filmmakers, even to this day, are trying to mimic and replicate what John Carpenter did back in 1978. Slashers, as we know it, wouldn't even exist without this movie's impact on the genre. This movie was a perfect template on how to create a villain. It was the perfect template on how to build tension. It was the perfect template on how to demonstrate good versus evil. This movie is a slow burn done right. This movie perfected the art of building a sense of dread, of knowing that the storm is coming, but never knowing when the lightning is going to strike. Many people don't even realize this because of all the unnecessary sequels, some of which I do like, by the way, but unnecessary nonetheless. But Halloween was intended to be a one and done. The ending where Dr. Loomis looks over the balcony and Michael's gone wasn't meant to be a cliffhanger. And if you pay attention to the narrative of the story being told, every character in this film had a complete story arc in this one little isolated film. You didn't need the sequels. Every single person had a complete story arc. This movie does have some dated aspects, however. Obviously, it suffers from what many low-budget independent films suffer from in the acting department, but I always say that this movie is more than the sum of its parts, and that's all because of Carpenter's masterful direction and filmmaking style. And then you have Dean Cundey's beautiful cinematography. It's a beautifully shot movie that feels so cinematic. I think this is a timeless film, and no matter how far along we get in filmmaking, this movie will always hold up for me. And number 3 on this list is Martin Scorsese's 2006 film, The Departed. So based on my taste of movies, this movie really had no business being as good as it was for me. I pretty much like all of Martin Scorsese's films, but I wouldn't consider any of them any of my favorite films. And a lot of them I didn't even watch until after I watched this, but I am a fan of his, but I digress. I went to the theater and saw this new with my friend and his mom when I was about 16, and I instantly fell in love. Even back then, I remember being so captivated by the story, and by this point, I was already a huge Jack Nicholson fan because of a movie that you'll actually see higher on this list. But this movie is also the movie that made me realize just how good of an actor Leonardo DiCaprio was. And prior to his performance in this movie, he was just that Titanic guy that all the chicks liked. But this movie really opened my eyes to just how much talent this guy has as an actor. And now, since this movie and because of this movie, he's become one of my favorite actors. Like, if I ever do a top 10 actors of all time, you'll see him not only on that list, but you'll see him high on that list. So, for the first two acts of this movie, you have what I would consider to be a typical crime drama. Now, granted, it's the best version of a crime drama. It is a great movie all the way through, but it is a crime drama nonetheless. And then when you get into the third act, this movie just hits you with so many twists and turns that you absolutely don't see coming. I mean, it literally changes the entire dynamic of the movie. It'll have you going back to earlier scenes and literally dissecting every little thing. I know this movie is kind of old now, but just because of how great it is and because it does have some pretty big twists and turns at the end, I don't want to spoil it for anyone, so I won't go into any major details with this movie, but I will actually be doing a review for this movie at some point. But I do encourage everyone, if you haven't already seen this, to go watch it as soon as possible. It's such a great movie. And like I said, this is the movie that made me a Scorsese's and DiCaprio fan, but honestly, every single person in this movie really brought it. We have a stellar cast all the way around. You've got Mark Wahlberg being great as usual. You've got Martin Sheen, Alec Baldwin, Vera Farmiga, and more. And then, of course, like I said, you have Jack Nicholson, and he's great in literally everything he does. So this was just a formula for success. You really can't always explain the connection you have with certain movies, and that's probably an example of that here, because I really can't explain why this movie means so much to me and why I love it so much aside from what I've already said here, but it is one of my favorite movies of all time, and I am unapologetically putting it right here as my number 3. But now we're at my number 2, and man, this was tough, guys. My number 1 and my number 2 were so close. I had such a hard time deciding which one was going where, but ultimately I decided that for my number 2, I was going with A Few Good Men. If you've seen my review for this, then you know that I already gave this movie a perfect score. So if you want to hear my detailed thoughts on this movie, you can go check out that review, and I'll leave a card for it at the end of this video. So I'll keep it short here. But this movie came out in a time when movies didn't have to be these larger-than-life comic book or franchise films to be major blockbusters. Case in point, A Few Good Men was a massive movie, and just like all the greatest movies of all time, it is dialogue and character-driven. The dialogue in this film is so iconic that it's being quoted even to this day.
You want answers?
I think I'm entitled.
You want answers?
I want the truth!
You can't handle the truth!
A lot of younger people may not even know where this particular line came from, but almost everybody knows the line itself. This particular scene has actually probably transcended the actual movie itself, and that's kind of funny to me because this has been one of my personal favorites since I was just a little kid, actually. I mean, I don't know how many other kids my age were watching this, and I'll be honest, I didn't go around just advertising that to everybody. So I don't know. But while other kids were watching Power Rangers and whatever other kid shows were on, I was watching this. Now, I was watching all of that stuff too, but I've had an appreciation for film since I was just a little kid. But like I said, I have reviewed this, and I'll leave a card for that at the end of this video. So go check that out when this video is over, unless you haven't seen the movie. And then I recommend that as soon as this video is over, you go watch this movie and then go watch my review. But moving on. And now for my number 1, the moment that nobody's been waiting for. Just kidding. Coming in at number 1 is 1995's Legends of the Fall. Now, at the beginning of this, I said that I wasn't necessarily claiming that any of these movies were perfect movies. Well, my number 1 and my number 2 are my exception. I think both of these movies are perfect movies. And I don't just mean perfect because I enjoy them. I mean, I think they're perfect movies. Narratively, they're perfect. And because of the performances given by the actors in both movies, I think they're perfect. That's why I had such a hard time figuring out which one was going where, because on any given day, they could both be my number one. And really, they are both number one, but because this is a ranking and only one of them could be number one for this ranking, I had to pick one. But honestly, I could wake up in the morning and feel differently about it. My number two could be my number one, but at the time of this recording, this is how everything fell. So Legends of the Fall is my number one. But whereas A Few Good Men is a courtroom drama and a lot more streamlined, Legends of the Fall is much more complex in its storytelling. Basically, it tells the story of a father and his three sons who, at the start of the movie, you can see are a very tight-knit family and are very close. But after the three sons go off to war against their father's wishes, there becomes a domino effect of tragedies, and from this point on, everything just starts falling apart. All the tragedy begins to mold and ultimately damage the fabric of their relationships. And as the movie unravels, you're watching the dynamic of this family just completely crumble. At the center of all this tragedy and deceit is Tristan, played by Brad Pitt. You are literally in his POV for most of the movie, and you're watching his descent into madness as his life and his family falls apart, and there's nothing he can do about it. But then in the final moments of this movie, like literally the last few minutes, you see forgiveness and healing among these brothers and their dad in what I believe is easily one of the most emotional and powerful scenes ever put to screen. I don't want to give too much more of this movie away because I really don't know how much of the younger audiences out there have seen this movie, and I don't want to spoil it. But if you haven't seen this movie, I highly recommend you watch it as soon as possible. I believe this movie is truly a cinematic masterpiece. But that's it for this video, guys. I would love to know what everyone else's top 5 favorite movies are. Heck, give me 10. Let me see your list down in the comments section and we can discuss it. Or you can find me on one of my socials, which are in the video descriptions of all my videos. In the meantime, go ahead and like and share this video. If you haven't already, please subscribe and I'll catch you guys in the next one.